But when that man asked him to recite the speech, he pretended to be shy, knowing full well that in the end he would deliver the speech even without an audience. So, Phaedrus, beg him to do now what he will eventually do anyway.
Then I suppose I should present the speech as well as I can, since you're not about to leave me alone until I speak one way or another.
You are right about that.
Then that's what I will do. Socrates, it is true that I have not memorized every word, but I can present the gist of what he said. I can begin at the beginning and go through all the main points in order, explaining the difference between making love to a lover and one who is not.
My friend, first you have to show me what you have up your left sleeve. I would guess that you have the speech itself. If so, you can be sure that even though I am fond of you, I will never let you practice your speech-making on me if we have Lysias himself. Come on now, show it to me.
That's enough, Socrates. You've destroyed my hope of practicing on you. Where would you like to sit while I read?
Let's leave the road here and walk along the Ilissus River. Then we can sit down as soon as we find a quiet place.
This is a good time for me to walk barefoot, as you always do. That makes it easier and quite pleasant for us to cool our feet by wading in the stream, especially at this time of the year and this time of day.
You lead the way and look for a place to sit.
Do you see that tall plane tree?
I do.
It's shady there, with a gentle breeze, and there's grass to sit on, or lie on if we prefer.
Let's go.
Tell me, Socrates, isn't this part of the Ilissus where they say that Boreas abducted Orithuia?
Yes, that's what they say.
Is this the actual spot? The water is pleasant here, and so pure and clear, a lovely place for a young woman to play.
No, that place must be several hundred yards downstream, where you cross over to the region of Agra. I believe there is an altar to Boreas somewhere around there.
I've never noticed it. But tell me, Socrates, do you think this myth is true?
It would not be unusual to deny such myths, as do smart people who know so much. I could devise a scientific explanation and say that she was playing with Pharmacia and the north wind. Boreas blasted her off those rocks. That is why some people say Boreas abducted her from there. Accounts of that sort are entertaining, but I do not envy those who tell them. This process will never end, because such people would then have to account for the shape of the centaurs and of the chimera, and would be overwhelmed by a horde of creatures, including the Gorgons, Pegasus, and others with strange, frightening qualities. Anyone who is skeptical and is eager to make sense of them through clever interpretation will waste a lot of time. But I have no time at all for such pursuits, my friend, and I will tell you why. So far, I am unable to know myself, as the inscription at Delphi prescribes. Given such ignorance, it seems to be ridiculous for me to investigate these things. That is why I ignore such matters and accept ordinary beliefs about them. As I just said, I examine myself to determine whether I happen to be an enraged and twisted beast even worse than Typhon, or a more gentle and modest creature that naturally partakes of what is divine. Look, my friend, while we were talking, we seem to have reached the tree toward which you were leading us.
Yes, that's it.
I swear by Hera that this is indeed a lovely place to rest. This plane tree is magnificent and broad, providing plenty of shade, and that willow is in full bloom, filling the whole area with a delightful aroma. The stream running under the plane tree is cool, if I can trust my feet. Judging from the statues around here, this place appears to be consecrated to Archelaus and some water nymphs. And observe the welcome and sweet breeze and how it mingles with the summery sound of a chorus of cicadas. Best of all is the grass that grows abundantly on the smooth bank, inviting you to stretch out and rest your head. So, My dear Phaedrus, you have done a splendid job guiding a stranger.
Socrates, you amaze me. You do seem to be a stranger who needs a guide, because you are definitely not at home in the country. I suppose that's because you never travel outside the walls of the city.
Please forgive me. I am a lover of learning, and neither trees nor fields teach me anything, but people in the city do. However, you seem to have used a drug to bring me here. Just as people lure a hungry animal by waving some green leaves or a bit of grain in front of it, you are able to lure me by holding out a speech. Clearly, you could lead me all over Attica or any place else you wish by holding out a manuscript. Well, now that we are here, I will lie down, and I urge you to choose whatever position you find comfortable and then read your speech.
Then listen.
Athens, he is very much sought after, and in particular, one orator named Lysias is attracted to him, but can't figure out how to seduce him. So he writes a speech of seduction. And Phaedrus is very impressed with this speech, and perhaps by implication impressed with Lysias. And he's decided to walk outside the city, outside the walls of the city, and practice the speech so that he can learn it, both its content and the proper mode of delivery. Now, symbolism is very important here. When we walk outside the walls of the city, we are moving from the realm of nomos, which is to say convention, political law, justice in the sophistic sense, towards nature. In other words, the sophists have established a sort of dichotomy between nomos and phusis, between conventional political law and the laws of nature and the facts of life. And by moving from the internal part of the city, we're moving symbolically from nomos to phusis, if you're willing to accept such a distinction. Phaedrus probably does. Certainly Lysias, the orator who wrote this, does. Now, on the way out of the city, Socrates sees Phaedrus, and Phaedrus is a little embarrassed, a little ashamed. He hides this speech under his cloak. Socrates, who is very hard to fool, knows that Phaedrus is hiding something. He says, well, let's continue on the journey. Let's move outside the city from the realm of the urban area to a lovely pastoral surrounding with a river and some trees and some grass, and let's go back to nature. So the symbolism here is that we're going to examine love as it naturally is, and we'll find out that the nature of love is not diminished by moving outside the realm of political or moral conventions. In other words, Socrates is going to try and undo the distinctions created by the sophists between nomos and phusis. What Socrates is going to do is show us that there's one overarching principle, the orderly and well-disciplined soul, which is true to the ideal of love, both within the city and without. So there's no distinction between the internal desires and the external man. There's no hypocrisy. There's no disjunction between the internal state of the soul and the external state of behavior. They're going to try and unify that. Whereas Phaedrus hasn't reached that point yet. He's ashamed and wants to hide the speech of seduction that he's brought with him. And Socrates says, come on, I want to hear your speech. You can't hide it from me. Come and you can repeat it to me. So they settle down by a river, and the river has mythological implications. It's a purely earthly love, but in the most pejorative possible sense. So Phaedrus gives this speech, reads it off the scroll, and Socrates makes a number of ironic comments about it. Phaedrus really admires it. He admires it so much that he's been going outside the city walls so that he can memorize it, because he thinks this is a great tribute both to love and to himself, and he thinks that this is real wisdom about love. And Socrates thinks, thank God I met you and was able to get to you before you memorized this sort of thing. It's a deeply corrupt sort of thing. I guess it's something analogous to what you might expect from something like Hugh Hefner. Right? So, well, no, I mean, it's the same idea, though. I mean, sex is something that you do to satisfy immediate bodily desires, and when you gratify yourself, you just move on. It's nothing to get excited about. Take a shower and forget it. It's not a big deal, right? It has no emotional resonance. It has nothing to do with souls. It is meat coming together. And for that reason, it is deeply dangerous to the education of youth. It is the opposite of love. It is the inverse of love. As Socrates will show us a little later on, love is primarily concerned with the benefit of the beloved. Love is primarily concerned with the construction of your own identity in the process of constructing the identity of the other. Real love, in the Platonic sense, first of all, is highly sexual. It doesn't have much to do with bodies, but it's highly emotive and desiring. It's not a pale ghost of love. Actually, it has tremendous emotional resources and emotional resonance. But here we have the foil of that first, the poor speech. And Socrates says, well, after thinking about it, the only difficulties that I see is that it's false in content and it's incoherent in form. But apart from that, it's a wonderful speech. And, of course, Phaedrus says, are you making a joke here? And what's really important about this is that this goes back to the Gorgias, right, and to other dialogues which people have said, Socrates, are you joking with us? Are you laughing at us? And, of course, Socrates is joking with you. Of course he's laughing at you. But the fact that he's joking doesn't mean that he isn't serious. This false dichotomy between being serious and being humorous collapses when we deal with Socrates. Of course it's a joke. What could be funnier than a stupid speech about love in which people really don't love each other and in which one person makes the other worse? That's not real love. That's the opposite of that. Everybody else is being much more ironic than he is. They just don't realize it. So Socrates says, I can give you a better speech than that. Right off the top of my head, it's really not a problem. The problem with this speech, with Lysias' speech, is that he treats love as the unreasoning desire for the beautiful, and you want as much of the beautiful as you can, and you want to absorb it as much as you can because it's all about gratification. Socrates says, I'll give you a better speech than that, no problem. What he does, before he gives this his first speech, which is the middle speech in the three that are offered in this dialogue, he puts a cloak over his head. I'll explain the symbolism of this in a little while, but he says, before I give this speech, this improved Lysias speech, I'm going to put a cloak over my head, and he does, and then he gives a speech, and it improves on Lysias. It's not the best speech, but it's a wonderfully moving speech. It's certainly a lot better than the speech of Lysias. And if you hadn't seen Socrates' final speech in this dialogue, you would think it was a terrific speech, that you could compare with any of the great speeches on love, any of the great speeches in Romeo and Juliet would be in the same league. It's just gorgeous. Well, what Socrates does is he says, look, I can improve this speech the following way. First thing I'm going to do is define my term. I'm going to explain to you what love is. That's a great improvement over Lysias. And then even if I don't have completely true knowledge about love, I can at least move towards an honorable, true opinion about love. And in addition to that, he's going to organize it in a logical progression, which is so important to any kind of Platonic conception of beauty. Beauty both in the beloved, that's one of the reasons why one falls in love, because you see an image of beauty in someone else, but also there's a beauty and a grace and a harmony in this speech itself. It actually moves from a beginning to a middle to an end. It makes sense. And that is attractive to Plato as an intellectual sort of beauty, in the same way that a well-formed horse, right, with a natural set proportion between the parts, might be a very attractive figure of the horse compared to one with very disproportionate parts. Well, this second speech, then, is an improved version of Lysias' speech, and what he says is, look, if love is an unreasoning desire for the beautiful, and it's just desire, it's just an emotional impulse, then it's always a bad idea. You should never fall in love if that's what love is. And although Socrates is able to explain love a little better than Lysias ever had, he really doesn't do it justice because he treats Lysias' assumptions, at least in part, as being true. That love is a kind of mere desire, and that it is an essentially unreasoning desire, and that it is, if not completely selfish, it is at least, it straddles the line between interest in the self and interest in the... At this point, Phaedrus stops him. Phaedrus says, no, stay here. It's scorching noonday. Right, because they started at the beginning of the day, went out. It is now scorching noonday. Please, don't go. Finish your speech. And I would like to know more about the non-lover. Praise the non-lover, just like Lysias did. You've made an improvement here, and your speech seems to be better. Take it the whole way. And Socrates says, no, I can't do that. I've done something wrong. Scorching noonday. Remember when the sun comes up and it's very hot? the rising of the good, or we're going to move from evil towards some kind of apogee, and then we're going to move towards a further elaboration of the good. Also in this case, heat is connected with the idea of passion, with the idea of emotion. This is the high point of passion, and now as the afternoon waxes and as the sun begins to set, we're going to have a setting of passion, and the decline of passion will be the rise of reason, and the rise of reason will be the articulation of noble love, of real love, of love in the Socratic sense. Well, Socrates breaks off in the middle of this speech, and he says, I've just praised the non-lover, or I've just praised the lover, and I've said the best I could about him, but the difficulty is that I don't want to go any further with this. I don't like this, the fact that you've brought me into this dialectic, that you've got me involved in talking about this. Socrates had made a few earlier references to Stesichorus and Ibycus. These are both lyric poets. Now, Plato, whenever he makes references to Greek literature, it's always important in the dialogue. And here we are in a pastoral setting talking about love. Stesichorus and Ibycus are two of the greatest lyric poets in Greek history. And this is literally Plato's attempt at creating a new and improved lyric. We're in nature, we've moved out of the city, and what's more appropriate to lyric poetry, and we're talking about powerful emotional experiences, which is the stuff of lyric poetry. And Socrates, during the speech, says, I'm becoming dithyrambic. Dithyramb is the typical metrical foot of lyric poetry. So Socrates is saying, I'm getting all excited, I'm losing control, I'm not creating the thoroughly logical, organized speech that I usually like to and that I would do if I could, and I don't want to go on with this because I think I've gone down the wrong path. So Socrates says, look, I have to go. Socrates says, I've just heard from my daimon. Remember that he has a daimon in his head that tells him only what he ought not to do. Never gives him any other information, just tells him what he ought not to do. And the daimon says, stay where you are, Socrates. You must stay where you are because you have done something impious. You have done something wrong. You have done something evil. Socrates, you must make amends because the gods have been listening. The gods will not tolerate this sort of slander of love. You sound like a man that knows no holy, honest, faithful, true love. And Socrates says, you're right. Remember what happened to Stesichorus? I suppose that I am going to have to make amends and give a second speech that will articulate the true nature of love. Now, since almost all of you don't know who Stesichorus is and what Stesichorus is, let me clue you in, because once you think about that element here, the whole dialogue begins to make a little more sense. Stesichorus is one of the great lyric poets of Greek literature. And he's well known for having made two speeches about Helen, Helen of Troy. The first speech, he was very, not a speech, but a poem about Helen of Troy. And in the first poem, he said some very unkind, very cruel things, gave her a very harsh evaluation. And as a result, the gods were wrathful, the gods were angry, and Stesichorus was blinded. Remember that Homer was blinded, or was blind all his life, but Stesichorus was made blind, and then and the reason why he had made this very impious, very critical speech of Helen is because he had read about Helen of Troy from Homer. So Homer is the real target here, right? Homer's been miseducating everyone, including the lyric poets. So as a consequence, the lyric poets don't understand about love. The exemplification of that is Helen of Troy here. And because of that, the gods are angry, and the gods deprive him of sight. Sight always being an image of moral knowledge. Think about the cave, right? Let's unify some of these symbols. Well, Stesichorus immediately understands what his transgression has been, and he understands how to purify himself, because purification is one of the big themes in this discourse. I'll discuss that in a second, but Stesichorus purifies himself by writing a new poem, an encomium on Helen. Not that she's entirely blameless, but that she doesn't deserve the same degree of criticism that she had gotten in his first poem. As a result, the gods give Stesichorus back his sight. Now, let's remember the fact that in this first speech, Socrates has a cloak over his head. He has voluntarily deprived himself of sight. Well, in this last speech that he is going to give, his improved speech on love, Socrates won't be wearing a cloak on his head because it will be analogous to the second speech of Stesichorus, the second speech which tells the truth about love. So he has given back his moral sight. He is no longer plagued by moral blindness, and the problem of impiety is resolved. So what Socrates is going to do is give a second speech which will be the true encomium on love. And that means that he has to start again from the beginning and chuck out just about everything that was in Lysias' speech, because it really can't be salvaged and yet turned into a good speech. A good speech will have to start from scratch. And as Socrates says in a very important line in the dialogue, the essence of good speech is telling the truth.